Counter-Strike was never really known for having cosmetic skins, a theme, or any real in-depth world building. Rather, the main focus throughout its life was mostly just its tight gameplay and maps. The most the average player would receive in world building was mostly through faction blurbs, map lore, and whatever else was sprinkled. At least you knew it was terrorists versus counter-terrorists, and there wasn't much need for anything else. However, as we transition into this new era of Counter-Strike with Counter-Strike 2, that has all completely changed. Each operator has their personality, lore, and voice lines, and operations weigh in heavily on Counter-Strike's behind-the-scenes lore. And overall just makes Counter-Strike more than just a game about Ts versus CTs fighting in nuclear facilities. It has a fictional narrative and lays the foundation of what is the modern Counter-Strike universe. However, what if I told you that Counter-Strike did attempt to have a more thematic attempt at world building through their characters with CSGO? In a time that almost seems like a lifetime ago, CSGO initially had a direction that it wanted to go with in its theme. Although subtle, CSGO leaned into the modern military aesthetic, as it was the most popular thing at the time, making Counter-Strike more like its competitors. Long gone were the vague locations filled with 80s movie trope villains from the Middle East and Soviet areas. The maps had more established themes, guns were more similar to their real-world counterparts, and most importantly, there were now established factions that resembled real-world groups. There were no skins, no operators, and almost everything about CSGO's aesthetic was tied to reality, and that included its factions. And that's what I want to talk about, the factions, because Valve abandoned what I thought was one of the best things about CSGO that gave it its character. What truly left me dumbfounded when CS2 came out was that Valve had abandoned all their stock factions except for two of them, the British SAS and the Phoenix Connection. Instead, now it seems that Valve expects players to buy operators in order to play other factions. While this is an okay compromise, unfortunately this left many factions from CSGO out of CS2, and I personally think that just sucks. I understand that CS2 has pretty much abandoned the modern military aesthetic for a more realistic fiction approach to the theme, but I am still going to miss CSGO's wider diversity with factions and how they made places feel real with consistent theming, something that I honestly would rather have than the mishmash of skins in different locations. Just like you wouldn't see South American guerrillas holding hostages in an urban office, you wouldn't see FBI agents defending a Middle Eastern compound. So as a farewell to CSGO's wide cast of factions that might likely never return due to reasons I'll get into, let's go into each of them, remaining and lost, and talk about what made them special, starting off with the remaining stock factions for CS2. It makes sense that in the ever-fictionalized and less realistic theme of CS2, the British SAS would stay as the poster child of CTs. Even in the real world, the British SAS are treated like a mythical elite military team that can infiltrate a hostage situation and make it home for crumpets and tea with time to spare. Also, with their iconic fisheye masks and distinct blue color scheme that contrasts their opponents and most maps, their designs are iconic and the right choice for CS2. They are a perfect representation of what CT is, and I applaud Valve for making the correct decision. On the flip side, rocking balaclavas and looking badass as hell, it's understandable why the Phoenix Connection is just so iconic and kept for CS2 as their default terrorist. Everything about their design screams terrorist threat with body armor and tactical gear, as well as Eastern European accents. What better faction is there to hold an AK-47? Even in CSGO, they represented the most used T faction and were in CSGO's official launch trailer. Valve made another perfect choice to represent the Ts as they are truly timeless, even in the face of real-world controversies which unfortunately plague other factions, but we'll get into it later. All in all, Valve made a good choice with the default skins for all-purpose use, and both fit their roles like a $300 glove. Moving on, let's talk about the more limited factions that still appear in CS2 but only as skins. But before I get into it, a pattern I'd like to point out is that these factions have more or less been flanderized to be less serious compared to their stock versions, which honestly, for better or for worse, does fit the different direction that CSGO was going on later in its life and then continuing in CS2. This is important to note because it allows Counter-Strike to have factions based on real-world groups without causing controversy since they resemble them less to a degree, and separates their association, making it more okay to include it in Counter-Strike. Things can't be said the same about other factions, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Let's start off with the most iconic of CS's factions, and the ones that populated the most played map, that being Dust 2. The Elite Crew is one of CS's oldest factions, first appearing in the original Counter-Strike. Their designs have changed over time, going from impromptu terrorists wearing baggy clothing and dirty jeans to a more organized threat with tactical gear and fitted clothing, which not only had to do with the graphic overhauls, but to lean more into the fictional territory. While the entire faction is fictional, it's not to say that they aren't based on real Middle Eastern groups, but when it comes to controversial things that regard the US in the world front, things appear to be more fair game. While the US has been involved in the Middle East and has been victim to many attacks from groups in this region, it isn't taboo to see them used in media, and this includes many other groups as well. It's just a culture thing. Unfortunately, this can't be said for other groups from other nations, which we will touch on later. Speaking of which, the SWAT and FBI factions are both American police forces that handle counterterrorism, with SWAT being specially trained local police, while the FBI works for the federal government, and both handle domestic situations. SEAL Team 6 is also federal, but deals with international threats as it is part of the Navy. SWAT wears mostly blue gear, while the FBI wears green and later reworked to blue, and then SEAL Team 6 wears green camouflage. These factions have been a staple for Counter-Strike as they are widely used throughout the game, and since they are American factions in an American game for American audiences, they all have purchasable skins since it's not really controversial to use them in any way you want. This is most apparent with their voice lines usually not being super serious, even messing around at times, being prideful, etc. It's unsurprising that they still exist within the game, which really can't be said about the next faction. The Balkans are another form of generic commie bad guys, but less iconic than the Phoenix Connection because they just look like dudes. But what they lack in appearance, they make up in voice lines and are menacing with their Slavic accents. For you unaware, however, they do represent one of the most brutal eras in Slavic history, those being the Yugoslav War and the Chechen War, both of which were riddled with war crimes and ethnic cleansing, many of which recorded on video. However, it appears that the reputation has largely been forgotten by the mainstream, and with the integration of the faction as part of Dr. Romanov's narrative, further making them generic commie bad guys, as well as no explicit reference to these events, it appears that the faction has gotten a pass to continue to exist within CS2. Unsurprisingly, the most reminiscent of movie heist characters still exist in Counter-Strike as purchasable skins as they are non-controversial and entirely fictional. However, while they still exist, their vibe has completely changed from smug bad guys to quirky comical bad guys, the Team Rocket of CS2. While this isn't the worst thing in the world, especially since Condom Man is my favorite skin in the game, I would still say that these characters are a little too out of form, even for CS2. Now, let's talk about forgotten and lost factions left behind in CSGO, but this time going from least controversial to most, as the more controversial in my opinion are probably never going to return, and these mostly consist of what I was talking about earlier, with some factions just being too touchy, especially in modern times. First off, the Pirates are a faction based on Somalian pirates that terrorize the African Horn and are probably never going to come back. Not because of their controversies, but rather because they've been effectively replaced by the guerrilla warfare faction. In design, they share a lot, and honestly, it's probably safer to go with a more vague and fictional faction than to specifically reference the Pirates, even if there was no real controversy with them in Counter-Strike. On the contrary, the Separatists are truly the only real faction to have gotten a legitimate form of protest when it came to their inclusion. They are based on a terrorist group from the Basque region with France and Spain that fought for their country's independence from the two nations. When they were announced, Spanish officials wrote to Valve to request the removal as it trivialized the conflict and was seen as insensitive to many of the victims, which is completely fair. The faction remained until the end of CSGO, probably since the group dissolved. However, the reason why they weren't included in any way for CS2 probably had to do with this incident. Not to mention that CS2's more fictional narrative just doesn't complement the faction well, and there was little to no chance of there being any kind of purchasable skin for the group, as there really wouldn't be any way to have them separated from the real-life group. If they did so, then Valve would be truly seen as completely insensitive. The anarchists are a representation of the youthful but violent nature of extremist activists that take matters into their own hands. They are the poster child of office and unfortunately are probably never going to return, even as skins. Not because it's completely unreasonable that they would even stand a chance against a trained CT force, but because while they are an American group, they are also related to the political divide in America that was most prevalent during the BLM riots. While international events are fair game, things that Valve just doesn't want to get involved with because of time wasted having to address it are going to get the axe, and that means this faction. However, it does make me sad to see them go, as they had a unique design with different bandanas covering their faces, being a lot skinnier than other factions showcasing their youth. This made this faction in particular memorable and charming, especially for those office enjoyers. Next up, we have the GIGN and the GSG-9, which are French and German elite counterterrorism forces respectively. They are accredited as legendary forces to most of the world, which makes it quite odd why they were excluded from CS2, even as purchasable skins. While things from not fitting CS2's lore to Valve's laziness are valid reasons, in my personal opinion, I think Valve for the time being are avoiding these factions because of the modern real-world acts of violence caused by terrorism in Western Europe. These events might just be a little too real and Valve's empathy too high to be referenced within CS2 at this time, even if they are good guys. Hopefully in time these groups do make a return to CS2, as they do have a very memorable design. Not to mention, they're also legendary groups just like the British SAS. Finally, the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, is Israel's regular army. You can pretty much turn on the news in our recent history to know why they probably are not going to be included in CS2 anytime in the future, especially as purchasable skins. Regardless, the reason why they weren't included in the first place can most likely be chalked up to the fact that it just doesn't fit CS2 anymore. Israel is rife with conflict, and putting a group from a country that is constantly dealing with real-world terrorism, especially with how CS2's themes are much less serious, it would be truly insensitive and tactless. So yeah, I don't think that this faction is ever going to return. CS2 doesn't have that same level of grit as CSGO did, so unfortunately a group like this, even as iconic as their designs were in CSGO, are just not going to return. Though I will personally miss this faction, as they did have some really good voice lines, and I mean, they represented Dust 2 for so long. It really is a shame to see them go. And that pretty much covers all the factions that were in CSGO's early years that are no longer featured, which is completely understandable why. CS2 is a much different game in terms of themes, even in a meta way, as CS2 aims to continue being a profitable esport. CSGO was released in a time where controversy and edginess was seen as a positive factor, however, that's the last thing that Valve wants now. Not just because of moral obligations, but also because it would hurt CS2's reputation. I would have preferred keeping them, as they did keep the game grounded, but times change and tastes change as well. Modern military shooters are just no longer the mainstream, and their competition now deals with fictional characters in fictional situations with fictional narratives. And even so, Valve still hits it out of the park. Rest in peace, CSGO, and your factions. You will be missed. But now I want to hear from you. What's your opinion on this whole thing, from the transition from CSGO to CS2? What are some of your favorite factions? Personally, my favorite were the Anarchists. Make sure to leave your opinion in the comments section down below. Like this video if you liked it, dislike it if you disliked it. If you'd like to support this channel, I do have memberships enabled on this channel, or you can also leave a super chat. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to my supporters. I will catch you guys later.